10 seconds from when? Now. Hello, everyone. My name is Tessin Noorani. I'm an independent researcher currently affiliated with the anthropology department at Durham University in the UK. It was an honor to be asked to moderate this final panel, Medicalizing Psychedelics. First, we'll introduce the panelists very briefly, and then I'll give a little intro to the topic before we have a conversation around a handful of key questions. And then towards the end, we can open it up to some audience questions. So panelists, could you give a brief introduction to yourselves? We could start with you, Liana.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Liana Sananda Giluli, and I currently work full-time as MAPS's development officer, raising the funds that we need to carry out MAPS's broad mission. I also founded North Star, which is an organization that is dedicated to integrating psychedelic wisdom into the emerging industry surrounding the field of psychedelics. And I co-founded Orem Project, a nonprofit incubator for organizations building equitable, affordable, and accessible psychedelic medicine for all. And that's me.
Thanks, Liana. Bennett?
Sure, thanks. My name is Bennett Zellner. I'm an associate professor of business and public policy at the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, College Park in the USA. I'm also co-founder of a new organization, which is called the Transformative Capital Institute. And our mission is to fund and collaborate on projects supporting the emergence of regenerative communities and the production of well-being. And my general focus in terms of my research and my advising is on the delivery of psychedelic-assisted mental health care, regenerative economics, and institutional change.
Thanks, Bennett. And Will?
Hi, everybody. I'm Will Hall. I am a PhD candidate at Maastricht University School for Mental Health and Neuroscience. I'm also a therapist working with individuals and families trained in open dialogue, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Hearing Voices Network USA.
Great. Okay, I'm really excited about this conversation. By way of intro, psychedelic medicalization processes we probably all know are moving really fast right now. But the study of medicalization in general goes back to the 1970s. At its core, that term medicalization refers to treating human problems as medical problems that should be treated with medical solutions provided through medically accredited services. I don't know about everyone else. At conferences like this, I often find there's a lot of talk about what we should do in an ideal world going forwards, this kind of thing, which, while vital as kind of strategic and imaginative work, can become merely best laid plans when facing the larger economic, political, social, and cultural dynamics of medicalization. The panelists here have all thought about medicalization in different ways and have critical and constructive analyses to offer. On Friday's panel, on Friday's accessibility and diversity panel, yesterday's on mainstreaming, and several others that I've seen so far, issues have been raised that will overlap with what we discuss here. So hopefully this will be a kind of synergistic end to the conference. And just to say, our goal here is not to reach solutions so much as to really explore some of the issues. So panelists, to get us started, could you all explain a little bit about how your work speaks to these questions of psychedelic medicalization? Who would like to begin?
I can go first. All right, so my focus in the psychedelic space is on the development of novel delivery of care approaches that depart from the current approach, which is focused on the use of pharmaceuticals to treat mental distress and is often actually referred to as the medical model. So the development of novel approaches that depart from this approach in two ways. So first, these approaches reflect a shift from the current focus on managing the symptoms of what is regarded as chronic disease and which is very profitable for shareholders, to a focus on producing well-being. Second, they also recognize that individual well-being depends on connection to the community. And so there's an intrinsic interdependence between individual and community well-being. This is also in contrast to the current approach, which embodies very kind of hyper-individualistic ideals and values that have themselves contributed to rising rates of mental distress.
Thank you, Bennett.
Sure.
I suppose I can go next. Obviously MAPS is best known for its pursuit of the medicalized approach in that context. My work also with North Star is very focused on the intersection of capitalists, kind of market-based forces, and the medical care system, which is really unique to America and places that don't have nationalized services. And so these questions of what are the incentives, or in many cases in the pharmaceutical industry, the perverse incentives that are fueling and feeding and guiding and shaping how this field is getting formed. And our goals with North Star are to ask some of the questions around what are the other considerations and the other models beyond the medical model that also need to be co-developed at the same time as the medical model. And I think that the medical model absolutely has its place, and it's urgently needed and necessary, yet it's very limited in what it can accomplish in terms of the ways in which this will become available. So I'm really curious about how to broaden the approaches to have more inclusion of the concerns, some of what Bennett was just naming, around what is the kind of social structures that fuel and create the conditions for a human being to be whole and to be flourishing. And many times those factors are outside of the medicalized framework, and those factors also contribute to a person's mental suffering that are also outside of the medicalized framework. So how are we addressing this socially and culturally as well as medically?
Thanks, Liana. Will?
Yeah, so in terms of medicalization, I mean, I think that there's a very strong rationale for going away from the war on drugs and prohibition, just from the standpoint of harms and harm reduction. So I'm definitely on board with that. My work over the past 15 years has really been in the dark side of medicalization. Some of the real failures that we've seen with the way that big pharma and the biomedical model of psychiatry has really caused a lot of damage and led us down a lot of blind alleys socially in terms of medical treatments. So my concern is really about how can we minimize harm in society, and is a medicalization approach actually setting us up for kind of waking up with a big hangover 25 years from now. I lived most of my life in San Francisco. I remember the days of the big tech bubble where everyone was excited about the dot-com boom and the coming wave of all these great technologies and social media. And here we are a few decades later, and we're actually watching the destruction of our democracy and the collapse of our civilization, partly contributed to by social media. So I'm concerned that we're in kind of a gold rush bubble period, and a lot of the science and the medical marketing is really largely opportunistic and not actually grounded in good science or in a solid consideration of what are the best ways to respond to mental distress in society.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate the analogy, the dot-com bubble. I think analogies can really help us think through some of these issues in this session. So welcome lots of them. I wonder one way to kind of dig in a little bit more to your views on this is to ask whether you see that whether you see if there are tensions between medicalization and wider legalization or decriminalization of psychedelics. Does anyone could anyone say anything on that?
Yeah, I can start us off on that. It's very interesting, right? Because I think that many people currently in the broad psychedelic community are quick to point out how radically different these approaches are, and they are incredibly different approaches. And I'll just say one of the reasons why I've so enjoyed working for an organization like MAPS is that it is right there in our mission statement that we are pursuing the many, the many modalities, the many ways that these people can experience the benefits of psychedelic substances. And so we are best known for the medical model that we are pursuing, but the larger vision and the understanding is borrowed from the analogy of the cannabis industry, which there is a strategic purpose in demonstrating through the scientific method the value and the fact that there is a medical purpose for these treatments, and that we can demonstrate that with quantifying and measuring and proving this out through the FDA process. I think that it is incredibly important to also be working on efforts in decriminalization. And that's really where my heart is, and what got me started in this work was early on, running into the system around the drug war. Getting arrested at age 18 for a small amount of cannabis really created an activist and an advocate out of me. And I'm coming through this from the lens of drug policy reform and the understanding that we need to create many different formats so people can have these transformational experiences. But I think beginning with, or having the current dominant narrative be around the medical, which part of the zeitgeist of the narrative is also around decriminalization initiatives, like what's happening in Oregon and Ann Arbor just passing a decrim nature resolution. So I really appreciate that this is happening at the same time. And I don't think there necessarily has to be a tension. I think that we generate the tension, right? But if we can see the value in a multiplicity of approaches and having a strong ecology, not just decrim and medical, but also the spiritual path, right? The expansion of the Religious Freedoms Act, the expansion of uses around churches, the model of the therapeutic approach that's outside of a medical system in Oregon. I want to see a multiplicity of ways in which people are pursuing access, and this liberalization of our drug policy reform is at the core of why the medical model was pursued in the first place by our founder, Rick Doblin, right? With the idea that we want to create the conditions for mass mental health. And in order to change stigma and change mass perception, which is what happened in cannabis. Now, I want to point out that in cannabis, the medical model was really fueled by grassroots people who were suffering with things like living with AIDS, that really drove cannabis policy reform. As soon as regular people were using cannabis to manage their cancer symptoms and things like that, we saw a massive shift in the public perception. We saw the government propaganda became less and less relevant. And so now we're seeing war veterans benefiting from MDMA therapy, and it's entered into the zeitgeist, and now regular people are benefiting from psychedelics. So it is contributing, I think, strategically to shifting the stigma that can then create the conditions for there to become more and more liberalized drug policy. And I think the overall goal is that people are educated, well educated on how to skillfully use these substances and can have a less and less mediated experience. And so I think that's really the ultimate goal. And I don't think there has to be a tension. I think that, I support all kinds of it, all the initiatives that are happening. I find they're not perfect. I have critiques against elements of each one of them, but all together, it creates this really broad narrative. And I really hear you, Will, on this tension with technology kind of coming back, and we're now having these big questions. Yet I think that the questions around medicalization aren't limited to psychedelics. It's really a question of health equity and who gains access. Marginalized populations don't have access to the same access to quality mental health care, especially, as other people. And so there's a much deeper social problem in how healthcare is delivered. And we don't look at the whole person. Your body examining your physiology doesn't ask you questions about your mental health, and vice versa. And so we've disconnected the system that, your doctor doesn't ask you about whether or not you have job security or food security. And so all of these things have become so disconnected that really the ideal vision that I hope that I'm playing for, and I think that in North Star, and what Bennett's working towards, is really about how to create these community care models that are unique to the populations that they're serving. But to me, the medicalization is a step along that path. And these other steps, like the decrim initiatives, are all contributing towards that same goal.
So I would say there's absolutely no doubt that the medicalization and the research has contributed to supporting the decrim initiatives, where activists in Oakland, for example, I'm a little bit more familiar, have used the medical framework and the medical research to support the argument for decriminalization. But I think that there's a much deeper question about medicalization than just equity, because equity and disparities in access, really from a pharmaceutical industry standpoint, is just a question of market expansion. How do we reach markets that we're not reaching? I think that if the medicalization approach is really a question of how do we make psychedelics more available in society, then we need to recognize that's what it is, because it's an opportunistic standpoint. It's just saying, okay, we want to make psychedelics available. The best way to do it is medicalization. So let's do that, because really what we want. But the problem is that we now have a giant psychedelic research industry, which is opening an incredible Pandora's box to the kind of future products, which is incredibly dangerous because of two reasons. First of all, it relies on a complete misunderstanding of what human suffering is. The idea of disease, the disease model of human suffering, ignores the fact that we're in a context of incredible and escalating social crisis. For example, the approach to trauma, for example, as an individual problem that can be treated in terms of individual neurochemistry, is really a betrayal of the women's movement. The women's movement brought trauma and abuse and sexual violence to the forefront of social consciousness in the 60s and 70s, not as a request for doctors to come up with better treatments, but as a real demand to make the prevention of violence and the prevention of trauma and the social solutions to a social crisis be what the response is. And so my concern is that there's a lot of questions. I don't think there's an equal playing field. I don't think that people are just promoting psychedelics in a broad way and really dealing honestly with, if it is a strategic and political opportunity move, then let's be honest about that. What is in fact happening is that there's a repetition of a cycle of very bad science happening. What we have is fundamentally what William James called medical materialism. We have an idea, first of all, that we can make these kind of simplistic, cartoonish analogies about how consciousness works. The human brain is the most complicated object in the universe. We have very little understanding of it, and we've come out of a steam engine imbalances and chemistry metaphor, and now we're in a computer network, neural connectivity and circuits metaphor. And I think Thomas Insel, the director, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, has really let the cat out of the bag, because he says, well, you know, for years we invested billions, if not trillions of dollars in research around depression and around ADHD based on this idea of chemical imbalances and serotonin levels. And then we marketed all these products based on this chemical imbalance ideology of how we can alleviate human suffering. And I'm old enough to remember the hype of the listening to Prozac era, where we're going to have designer personalities, because SSRIs, Prozac, are not drugs. They're treatments that are going to change the disease that's going on in the brain. And it's a complete mystification of actually what is known and what is not known about the brain. So now that the chemical imbalance wave has now gone down, that those products are no longer as profitable, now we have another whole cartoonish medical materialism, which is the idea of neural circuitry and the idea that we're going to somehow rejuvenate connectivity in the brain using psychedelic drugs. But really, this is cramming what is fundamentally a psychoactive drug into some kind of disease model of treatment. And of course, if you read the research closely, it's all about more research is needed. There were associations on an MRI. There could be correlations. There are links suggested. And it all comes back to the gold rush mentality. It all comes back to the expansion of the research and the expansion of the industry of mental health. So really, if we're really fundamentally going to grapple with how we want to meet the human needs of human suffering in society, we kind of have to come back to the roots of psychedelia, which is about questioning authority and questioning reality. Why have we suddenly forgotten this whole question of revolutionizing society? For me, the question of a revolution in society is more on the table than it's ever been. And suddenly psychedelics is on the side of just business as usual with the mainstream healthcare model. We need an explicit endorsement of universal healthcare and Medicare for all. We need an explicit approach to the fundamental needs of society. And that's where psychedelia should be allied, not this kind of opportunist involvement in the next wave of a really bad science medicalization model that was extremely profitable for a while, and now there's another wave coming. And I really think we want to anticipate that if we don't get a hold of this soon, we're headed in the Brave New World direction, because it's not going to be growing psilocybin in your basement and sharing it at a party with friends. It's going to be very strange Franken-drugs that are mixtures of different kinds of chemicals that don't have adequate testing. We've already saw what the wave of SSRIs and other drugs did in terms of iatrogenic harm. So if we escalate that to a larger scale with psychedelics, and then we put it in the context of a civilization that's facing collapse, I mean that quite literally and scientifically, we're really setting up a very, very disturbing scenario. And my question is, why aren't psychedelic researchers talking about this?
I'll just add a couple of comments. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to almost everything that's been said. And, you know, I also think at the same time that in some ways the question of to medicalize or not to medicalize is not the right question to ask, because it's happening. So I think the real question to ask, and this kind of gets to some of what both Liana and Will said about really trying to create revolutionary or systemic change, is how do we achieve systems change? And the systems change that needs to happen in the healthcare system is, I think, what I mentioned earlier, a shift from a focus on the management of disease, or the disease model as Will was calling it. I think it's the same thing as the medical model, to a shift on the production of well-being for all, so inclusive well-being. So how do we do that? I think that organizations like MAPS and USONA are truly dedicated to trying to do things differently. And I think they're heroes, and we should applaud their efforts. I think at the same time, we also need to create space for efforts that have no connection to the infrastructure of the existing healthcare system, to make space for something fundamentally new to grow. I mean, there are certainly those that would argue that it's difficult, if not impossible, to create something fundamentally new, fundamentally new system using elements of the old system that you're trying to replace. And we could go down the rabbit hole on, kind of analyzing that. So maybe that's for later. But the point is, I think that these efforts, as many efforts as possible, should proceed in parallel. And, in terms of the work that I've done, maybe I'll have a chance to talk about this a bit more later. I advocate an approach that's called the pollination approach. And so I think that we should plant as many seeds as possible. And that will give us the best chance of creating something that's fundamentally new and isn't kind of captured and doesn't replicate the existing interests and patterns that I think are the problem in the current system.
I'd just love to add one more thing to this as well, which is just pointing to some of what Will was saying. To me, is really about the fact that the perverse incentives of capitalism can guide and fuel the way that a medical industry gets built. Is, like I said earlier, uniquely American in many senses. It happens other places as well, but that's the root cause, right? That's the root problem. If we're talking about in its purest form, right, what the scientific method is, what the FDA is attempting to do, it's to understand what is safe and what is effective. We have to apply reductionary scientific method in order to get reproducible results. And so, yes, there are ways that can be manipulated and things like that, but at its core, it's trying to do a good thing, right? And so I don't necessarily think that our issues are around, we have to be critical and we have to examine, what those variables are that can shift outcomes. But I think what we really need to do is question, why do we live, right, in a system where the people who have the most need have the least access to care, and where these treatments stand and potentially could be quite unaffordable and inaccessible to the majority of people unless we do something about it. And so, at MAPS, we have now we're fundraising for our health equity initiatives. We're doing, we've already put certain programs into place, and we're doing what we can. And we are a nonprofit drug development organization, of which there's only, I think, 3 of active in the United States right now, because it's extremely outside of the dominant paradigm to do something as cost intensive as run through the FDA process in a nonprofit context. right? That is why there's big money. And I think, you know, to Will's point as well, there's this kind of gold rush money grab energy, because people just see an opportunity to sell a new product. Well, in my mind, if you're really, you know, working with these medicines correctly, you're not going to need them, you know, a whole bunch of times. You're not going to need to take them daily, which is the current pharmaceutical model, right? So there's much deeper questions. And then in addition, it's how do we create a society that doesn't generate trauma and doesn't, you know, fuel the kinds of mental suffering that we see so rampantly in our culture right now.
I wonder if it touched on something that some of you mentioned. Is this question about whether psychedelics need to be used once or twice or how many times. It's common for the efficacy rates of new treatments to fall when they are scaled up. What do some of you think are some of the issues that come into play in relation to this with psychedelic therapy? And do you have ideas on how that can be overcome?
Yeah, I'll start if it's okay. Yeah, so I think the key insight to recognize here is that psychedelics help people overcome mental distress largely by creating openness to connection. And I think this is intuitive for people who are experienced with psychedelics. There's also some great research by Roz Watts and her colleagues that demonstrates this pretty effectively. And so the vast healing potential of psychedelics in our culture is, I would say, amplified by what's already been referred to several times in this conversation, by the disconnection, the social fragmentation that affects so many people in our society. It's often been referred to as a crisis of connection, or the US former Surgeon General referred to it as a loneliness epidemic. Even prior to COVID, increasing numbers of people were feeling disconnected, and there's lots of evidence for this, and this has contributed to sharply increasing rates of depression, of anxiety, of addiction, of suicide. So to get to your question about long-term efficacy, I think that in terms of long-term efficacy, there's a real risk that if you successfully treat someone with psychedelics, and so they're now open to connection, they're feeling better, and you then place them, or you allow them to just re-enter the same alienating, disconnected environment that likely contributed to their mental distress in the first place, the positive effects of the treatment may very well not persist. And I don't think we have data on this because, you know, most studies have, you know, a 6-month follow-up window or something like that. So the approach that I mentioned earlier, the pollination approach, which I've spoken, I won't go into great detail about it because I've spoken about it at several conferences in the past year. And for those who want more information, I also wrote an article for the MAPS Bulletin earlier this year, which details it. But the core idea behind the pollination approach is it leverages the openness to connection that people who have had psychedelic experiences typically feel by explicitly reconnecting them to community social, economic, and ecological systems. So in doing this, it not only contributes to individual healing, but it also contributes to the revitalization of the community systems themselves. So this is an example of what I meant earlier when I talked about developing approaches that recognize the intrinsic interdependence between the well-being of the individual and that of the community.
Yeah, I just say, I mean, that sounds like a beautiful vision. I would endorse such a vision. I don't think it's possible without guaranteed living wage, universal health care, housing as a basic right, universal basic income, trade unions, these kinds of things. I think that it's actually set up to kind of like ultimately be co-opted in the way that the beautiful story about a poly story, is that what it was?
We will call it Paula as the name of the story.
We will call it Paula, which I just read last night. I think it's a wonderful cautionary tale about the power of neoliberalism to destroy and co-opt and twist the potentials and the visions that we have. And I think that's the hangover that we could end up waking up around. But I think that there's a deeper question about how do psychedelics create these possibilities. And I think one of the kinds of interesting research that's come out has been the naturalistic studies of psychedelic users in the general population outside of medical treatment contexts who have better rates of mental health, who have lower rates of suicide. We have a long history of people in the wild, so to speak, using psychedelics, kind of going against a lot of the scare stories about the risks, giving us a lot of good information about the association of psychedelics to rise in the rates of psychotic disorders, which has not happened, for example. And so I think that's the direction that the research ought to be going. I mean, I think one of the most interesting research that I saw recently was the research that was done on placebodelia by McGill University, where they took a group of people, gave them placebo, inert substance, telling them that it was going to be a psychedelic. They created an entire setting with expectation, and the majority of people had psychedelic effects from that experience, just from a placebo. That suggests an arena of how do we work with context, social setting, how do we work with the social form that these treatments are delivered in as a way of generating a change. And so for me, I think it's also interesting that the whole ayahuasca experience has not been kind of at the center of psychedelic research because it's not as commodifiable. First of all, the chemical substance of different ayahuasca brews among different facilitators is very different. But I also think that ayahuasca is much more like a community building experience, like the pollination that you're describing. People typically go back to the same circle, they make connections, and there's a very, very strong cultural component. But that hasn't been the direction that the research is going in because it's not deliverable as a product. What is deliverable is something like trauma treatment. I have to say, I'm a trauma survivor. I want people to have the best treatments available. I'm very disturbed by the idea that we're going to do individual biochemical trauma treatments because one of the biggest investors in trauma healing is the military. I don't want to see the military invest in soldiers, send them out to kill. They get injured emotionally and psychologically. Now they get a trauma treatment, and then the entire cycle can be continued. We need to think about the causes of trauma and the fact that these very idealistic images that we have of connection and the psychedelic opening and all these positive experiences that people have can very easily and readily just be completely twisted into their opposite unless we grapple with the political and social context that we're talking about. So, I mean, that's a larger question. We can also go into the actual research itself, which I really think that we're underestimating the degree of scientific corruption that's going on. The history of randomized controlled trials in the US in terms of endorsing extremely dangerous drugs in the field of mental health is really bad. We don't have a robust, positive regulatory function. We don't have a good, solid scientific base. So again, a lot of the psychedelic research, a lot of the psychedelic push is really more opportunist by what tends to be people who are true believers and advocates from the very beginning, trying to just get psychedelics into society. Now, again, I'm not in favor of the war on drugs, but I think that unless we're honest about this, unless we're explicit about it, and we talk about what the limits and what's actually going on with the research, instead of having these kind of cartoon ideas of neural networks and that don't even address the hard question of where consciousness comes from or even what consciousness is, unless we have some kind of honesty around that, we're just setting ourselves up for more and more cycles of very toxic products in the future that actually just not actually going to deal with the issues of human suffering, but they're going to make a lot of people a lot of money.
Yeah, Will, I hear you on that. And I also just will say that, you know, MDMA therapy works for trauma. I mean, the results are speak for themselves. And I think that we have insufficient treatments in our mental health care paradigm in general for the treatment of some of the biggest things that people deal with: depression, generalized anxiety, end of life suffering, like all of these things, right? And I, for one, think that if there is a model and if there is a way and there is a delivery system that people who are suffering with trauma can benefit from MDMA therapy, then they absolutely should. I don't think that we should stop there. I don't think that's the end of the story.
But let me just jump in, because what you just did was a statistical and logical fallacy, which is absolutely endemic in medical research in general, but also around psychedelics. You said that MDMA is an effective treatment for trauma. The scientific research does not support that. What it supports is that there are large numbers of people who report in certain kinds of research controlled trials positive results, but there also are people who have panic attacks as a result of MDMA, and you didn't mention that. And so my point is that as long as we continue to be in the, for example, one of the statistical fallacies is the first past the post, the idea that, which drug is better, this one scored better, therefore that one is going to work. And these messages that are so easily reproduced, and they're deeply, deeply misleading, and they just end up people thinking, well, I have trauma, let me go for my trauma treatment in MDMA, rather than saying, well, okay, I had this traumatic experience. What are my options? Okay, MDMA is presented, and here's some statistics that say a certain percentage of people, a high percentage of people, will report something positive. But there are other options, and there's criticism, and there's other things that I can do with trauma, like joining a storytelling group in my local community, being involved as a political advocate and activist. That also, research also shows depression is a good example. There's treatments that you can treat people with placebo, and they will improve with depression. I think that some of the results about MDMA trauma are also placebo, of course, but also you can treat people with depression by giving them small micro community loans. You can get them involved in economic cooperatives where they're making money. And it turns out that their poverty and their economic disempowerment were a huge factor of their depression. And then you can reliably show that people will be alleviated with their depression. So do we live in an environment where people are going to get a range of options and they can look at these things and they can kind of make a harm reduction decision for themselves? No, what they're going to get is a line that says MDMA is the new treatment for trauma, where it's just not founded in scientific fact. And we've been through this. Prozac is the new treatment for depression. Now, a lot of people got mania from taking Prozac because it wasn't advertised as a side effect of Prozac. Those people went on to get bipolar diagnosis, and then they go down a rabbit hole. And then people like me and the Hearing Voices movement and the psychiatric survivor movement, we deal with the fallout, which is that lives get destroyed. People get very damaged by this. The side effect and risk profile of psychedelics is far lower than SSRIs or the antipsychotics. There's no argument there at all. But what we've done is we've continued down the road of a kind of a dishonest scientific enterprise in the context of capitalist market expansion. And that, I think, is the big danger, the corruption of science here.
Will, I thank you so much for inviting me to speak and use my words much more clearly, right? So what I can say is that MDMA has proven to be effective in 2/3 of study participants, which is an enormous delta, right? When you're looking at other research and other currently available treatments for PTSD. I don't think anyone in the scientific, professional, medical field would say that there's one treatment that works for everyone. I think that in general, this idea that people are individual and unique and that we need to look at the whole person and the whole system is a very good concept. And I think that we have to look at many different modalities of treatment. I constantly point to the work being done by the Wellbeing Trust, which has put out a set of policy initiatives called Healing the Nation. Their entire mission is to generate well-being in communities. And what they've proposed is that you don't just need more mental health clinics, you need everything that you're naming, Will. You need to have job security, home housing security, food security, purpose, like all of these things create the environment for human flourishing. And so I think that I really appreciate what you're saying around where our limitations are and where we need to remain critical. It's incredibly important that we are taking things through a critical lens. And also, I agree that, just look at the prevalence of ads on television trying to sell you pharmaceutical drugs, right? But again, to me, that points more towards the perverse incentives of capitalism. Right. And I understand, to me, that's where the intersection gets interesting, because if you go over to Europe where they have nationalized healthcare system, they actually, the nationalized system sets the price of the drug and the treatment, not the company that's promoting it and pushing it. And so, this is where it gets really dicey for us in the United States. And so I hear you that there's a lot of people pushing all kinds of ideas. Oh, just take this microdose of LSD and do this and you'll be healed and cured. We need to be very careful and speak very carefully about what the potentials are here and what the limitations and potential risks are. And I think that there's in general not enough conversation around the risks, around overuse, overprescribing potentially of these sorts of things, not looking at, not considering whether or not a person, and I don't know if we even have enough information at this point to be able to tell if a person's going to have an adverse reaction or event under one of these treatments. And so I constantly remind people that this is the very, very, very beginning of an extraordinarily broad field. And yes, I believe that I would like to see more research dollars funded to other things. And it's not true that 100% of research is just looking at creating products. You know, there was just like a DMT study done on like interacting with entities, which like, to me, I'm like, I would have preferred to done some research on some other things, but that wasn't to generate a product, right? That was a genuine curiosity that was being explored by researchers. And I think that there's like, this has been an under-resourced field in general. Like MAPS has never received any national funding from any of the systems to do this research. It's all been funded by philanthropists and individuals who care about these things. But as this field grows and develops, my hope is that there will be more dollars available from many other places to examine, you know, one of the projects we're working on is actually research where Palestinians and Israelis, it's a peace building study, drink ayahuasca together to look at whether or not they can build peace and whether or not they can find common ground. And there's already a group of people, Palestinians and Israelis, who are drinking ayahuasca together that have been interviewed by the team that's working on this. And so that is not, there's no product to be produced at the end of the day, but there is this question that's being examined. So I think that, you know, I think these points are really good, but I also think that there's, that this is like a yes and situation, that there's more that we don't know than that we do know about these substances and how they work. And so it's important for us to be very cautious and critical in moving forward and not just go running down the field saying we're going to solve all the world's problems with psychedelics. That's magical thinking, and it's not, you know, good for us to be doing that. But I also think that, you know, there's absolutely a place, and there's absolutely people who are suffering that can benefit from controlled experiences, and will only approach using psychedelics in a medicalized framework, you know, because of the success of the war on drugs and the propaganda that went along with it.
Yeah, and I would just add one comment, which is that, yes, it's true, Will, that research hasn't yet delved into social influences, and you know, the research is focused mainly on the molecules so far, but the research is in its infancy. And it's also not the researchers who are designing the delivery of care systems. And that's a lot of what we're talking about here, is how is the care actually going to be delivered? And the organizations that do have a lot more influence over that right now are organizations like MAPS and USONA. And I know for a fact that both of these organizations embrace the pollination approach. They understand the importance of the context, of the psychosocial context in which somebody operates on their overall well-being. So I guess there are other reasons why I'm a little more optimistic than you as well, but I just wanted to note that one in this discussion.
I'm going to jump in here. I wish we had longer. 50 minutes for medicalization of psychedelics. We've got lots of good questions. One thing I just wanted to pull out from listening to that conversation just now is a sense that if going forwards, the kind of research money for looking into the effects of psychedelics is determined by market logics, we might anticipate an underinvestment in researching the dark side of psychedelic experiences. It's something that we've seen in relation to psychiatric meds a lot, and I'm sure that you can speak to that. Unless you'd like to, I wonder if I could read a question or two. But anyone would like to just say anything, add in anything else?
I think you pointed out, it's like we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Let's just look at the history of promising, innovative treatments for fill in the blank mental health condition, and that's likely to be what's coming down the pipe. I don't think it's a question of the research being in its infancy. The schizophrenia research goes back to the very beginning of psychiatry, and the kinds of research that address these social factors, just child abuse, poverty, and neglect, which are clearly central in what the etiology of schizophrenia, are massively under-researched. And what's incredibly been researched instead is genetics, and which has produced no real treatment has come from genetic research, and is completely inconclusive. So I don't think we should underestimate the power of the political context and the economic context for completely driving the research in a real dead end as far as actual scientific discovery around this.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that I've firsthand witnessed where people have had very adverse experiences with psychedelics, and I don't think it does get enough airtime, and that we don't understand enough about it. And I do agree that it would serve us, in generally as a movement in research to examine those things much more closely.
Can I just say something about the we don't know that much about it piece? I think that actually psychedelics are a lot more simple than we give them credit for. Psychedelics are drugs. They get you high. Different people are going to have different reactions to drugs. Some people are going to have very positive, sympathetic reactions to alcohol. Some people are going to have overwhelmed, scary, negative reactions. Other people are going to have addictive responses. And because we don't see drug psychoactives as psychoactives, we create a kind of a psychedelic exceptionalism that has cut us off from all this research and all this that we already know about psychoactives and the individuality, the individual responsiveness that people have to psychoactives. And we don't want to face that because the preoccupation is on this mass deployment. It's the idea of reproducibility and the control, rather than saying that, look, psychoactive substances have extremely different responses in different contexts, different people. That's all. If you look at the history of psilocybin mushrooms throughout human civilization, there have been completely radically different contexts for interpreting that experience, from exalted, seeing the angels, to this is just toxic garbage I need to get rid of. So I think we need to really anticipate that, rather than going on this sort of search for the cause of why one person has a negative or one person has a positive. It's because we're individuals, and we make meaning and we make sense in our own way, uniquely, around all of our experiences, but especially around those mind-altering, high-inducing experiences. It's up to us as individuals to make meaning about that.
Yeah, I'd like to just briefly go back to the question. And so the question was about, will market logics lead to underinvestment in researching the negative experience and fallout of psychedelic use? And I certainly can't say for certain whether they will, but I think what I can say, and I think this is really where some of the conversation needs to be, is that we live in a paradigm, an economic paradigm, that doesn't account for the costs of learning. This is actually one of the main ways in which the existing paradigm perpetuates itself. You write up a business plan, you put in some milestones, which are largely made up, and when you can't meet them, the investors come in and profit maximization, rules the day, and you have business as usual. So there is no question that if we want to develop fundamentally new approaches for delivering mental health care and for producing well-being, that there are going to be learning costs and there are going to be course corrections. We have to recognize that everything that we're going to do, everything we're going to try, is a prototype. So I think that it would be helpful, maybe not right now because we don't have a lot of time left, but it would be helpful to focus a lot of the conversation on how do we develop economic structures, how do we develop financing structures that create the space for learning and the development of new approaches actually to occur. I agree that the current system has a great deal of, institutions are very powerful forces, and there are many, many examples of the current system co-opting what originally looked like, novel efforts to try something different. But I don't think that means that we need to just, give up and kind of just bemoan the state of things. I think that what we need to do is make concerted efforts to create a container in which new efforts can flourish. And so that, at least in my work, that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm devoting my efforts to.
So just real quickly on that. So we have the history of antipsychotic drugs causing tardive dyskinesia, and we still have not got any significant research into that in a meaningful way, in addressing the many, many people who've had a debilitating neurological disorder as a side effect of antipsychotics. Now, as I've said before, I'm clear about this, the side effect profile of psychedelics is much milder, but there are a lot of things that are lurking in terms of future drugs and also in terms of the current use of psychedelics that should be looked at. I think we all know people who've gone off the deep end with psychedelics. They've had personality changes, or they become very inflated or overconfident. There's a certain kind of fragmentation or overwhelm I think that psychedelics can actually sometimes be an agent of trauma. They can produce a kind of a traumatic overwhelm, and then the person kind of gets in denial and dissociated. But that's what we know about drugs in general. Create a high, you create an overwhelming experience. You can sometimes cause compartmentalization, fragmentation, denial, dissociation in the psyche. That's something that isn't really being looked at, and I worry about, are we offering these products with a message that says this is a treatment for trauma, or are we actually giving a much more honest message? I think the place to do that is in the context of community use and in the context of a broader availability to these drugs, rather than medicalizing and pushing them in terms of how are we going to offer the next wave of treatments for mental diseases.
Can I jump in? Joost, I don't know if you're just lurking or if, but we're 1 minute over and we haven't asked any questions.
Take a couple more minutes. This is an important discussion. This is the final panel of the conference. You can take a little bit more time.
Okay, thanks. Like a god. Well, let's just throw in a couple of questions. There's some great ones here. One that's been upvoted a lot more than the rest, so I think it needs to be asked is Compass, the psilocybin company, does not consider it to be a prerequisite for the therapists they train to have personal experiences of psilocybin. To me, this seems to be a sign of a radical medicalization with wide perspectives. What do the panelists think?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. These are such incredibly unique experiences. And so I feel very grateful that MAPS was able to have about 89 therapists go through what we call MT2, or in that case, it was a training to actually have a direct experience with MDMA therapy as part of their training. But we also made it optional. So there's 5 parts in the training, and one of them is experiential. And one of the options in the experiential in the past has been to take MDMA therapy as part of your training. We also recommend, if people don't want to do that, holotropic breath work, which creates, kind of similar inducement of a psychedelic state. And really what you learn in holotropic breath work is how to hold space for somebody who's undergoing a massive, experience with themselves. I think that, we are in the process of having a new wave of therapists be approved by FDA to have that direct experience. It is a very unusual protocol. It is not, I can't really point to another example in medicine of therapists, having an experience, with a drug, especially before they prescribe it. So I understand the debates on both sides, but I think we at MAPS are going to continue to push for that being an option for people who want to experience it, because it can so greatly inform a person on how to show up in that space. These are really difficult experiences to describe. And so I think it is important. That being said, I think that my hope would be that anyone who's providing this experience, I think that they're going to be more informed potentially if they've had a direct experience. But that being said, I'm not necessarily against it either, because I think there's a lot of people who want to be in service, who want to support people who are suffering. And if they can learn the basics and they can learn how to be there and hold space. And, at Zendo Project, we've trained thousands of people in the art of peer support. And we're now expanding that program. And that's a harm reduction. So we do psychedelic harm reduction at events and festivals like Burning Man, where people are having difficult or challenging experiences on psychedelics. And they're trained in the 4 basic principles of how to hold space for people. And I think that, it's a little bit more difficult when you have somebody who's potentially in a much higher need state. If they have something like treatment-resistant depression, they might need to be with a person who's well-trained in various different ways that a peer support person might not be. But in my opinion, we're moving towards a paradigm. And what I love about the training at Zendo is that it's actually great training to even just be a good friend for another friend who's going through a difficult time in life, right? And so I think that there's like, we can get really mad about like the way Compass is doing things. And at the end of the day, this is all like, we're in a grand experiment right now. And it remains to be seen whether or not it will make that big of a difference if a person has had a direct experience or not. You know, of course, having had direct experiences of myself, I feel like it would greatly inform a person. But at the same time, the need is so vast and so broad that the more people that can learn how to safely provide these experiences, the more benefit it's going to bring to the people who need these experiences or could benefit from these experiences.
Let me ask a couple more questions. Thank you, Liana. The next one, sort of upvoted, is what are the panelists' opinions on monopolies in an emerging for-profit psychedelic therapy era? What Amazon is for retail, Google for search, the current gold rush is, needless to say, an expression of the realization that this field can be monopolized in various ways. I suppose in relation to that, Bennett, you didn't speak in particular about how you are envisaging the pollination approach being successful or not being kind of overrun by a whole load of psychedelic local spas that are 95% run by for-profit psychedelic companies. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about, just a tiny bit about how you envisage that happening.
Sure. Sure. Well, I mean, first I should say that I'm opposed to the monopolization or the attempted monopolization, especially of substances like psilocybin that exist in nature. And I think that this logic of monopolization, this exclusionary logic, is the core issue in our current system. And even if we don't want to have more of a debate here or more of a discussion here about economics and capitalism, that that kind of divisive exclusionary logic is what's making a lot of people sick in the first place. So just purely in terms of effective treatment. In terms of the pollination approach, yeah, I don't actually see where the big advantage lies for these kind of these ideas about what corporate approaches might look like. I mean, where are the economies? If you have let's say you have an independent community-based clinic, and then you have a corporately owned clinic that's part of a chain. Arguably, the community-based clinic will be providing a higher quality service. If the corporate outfit is trying to cut costs, that's going to reduce the quality of the service. So I don't see a huge advantage there. And there are no monopolies there are no economies of scale in providing treatment. I mean, you still need the substance, you still need the guide. The corporations might have some advantages in terms of economies of scale and backbone structures like data systems and things of that nature. But I'm aware of efforts to make these backbone resources available to independent providers on kind of a group basis. So that one company provides the backbone services, and then these independent providers can contract to use as backbone services. So that was maybe, that was a little bit detailed, I guess, but I think the bottom line is that if you actually go through the economics of this, I just don't see the advantage for the corporate providers. I think that answers your question. I hope it does.
Yeah, I'd love to just add a little bit onto that, because it is the primary drive of our work at North Star and in Oran Project as well. And I'll make a plug for people just to check out northstar.guide and the pledge that we've got up there, which is really a tool for self-reflection. So there's the business as usual way, which is outlined in the question that you just stated. And then there's an opportunity. So in one level, it's like, how can we reduce the potential harm of business as usual? And there's some of our activity at North Star is oriented towards that. But what's even more interesting, there's movements that are happening outside of our field of psychedelics in steward ownership and stakeholder capitalism. I recommend the book Donut Economics. There's an entire shift that's happening right now beyond conscious capitalism, beyond triple bottom line. People are wondering how we can do things differently. And I think that that's a really exciting question. And being part of an emergent field in an emergent industry is a huge opportunity for us to create enough of a critical mass of people who are interested in doing things differently to get together and put these ideas into work and into practice. And so that's really exciting to me. And otherwise, it's just more of the same. right? And
Yeah.
so far we know that the same has not benefited, the majority of people out there. So
if I could just add one, I know we're just about out of time, but I'll just add one brief comment. I fully agree with everything Liana just said. I think there's lots of amazing work going on, people really trying to do things differently and with some great ideas about that. I also think that if you look at the current state of the world, you look at the dysfunction and arguably incipient collapse of multiple systems at the same time, our social systems, our economic systems, our ecological systems, health systems with COVID. This creates the conditions for something fundamentally new to emerge. If you look at complex systems theory, when systems experience small to moderate disturbances, they tend to restore their prior equilibrium. But when multiple systems start to collapse at the same time, and when the roots of that collapse, when they have a common root for that collapse, it's under those circumstances, under those conditions of near chaos, which is my experience of the world at the moment, that what complexity system theorists would refer to as a higher order complexity can emerge. So I think that the conditions for something new to emerge are ripe, and I fully agree with Liana that I can't think of a better area for a piece of this emergence to occur in than the psychedelic, in the world of psychedelics, the field of psychedelics.
I would agree that the conditions for something new to emerge are there, but we have to ask for the changes. We can't just wait for the collapse to happen. And I think that asking these fundamental political economic questions about the context in neoliberal capitalism for the repetition of what we've seen as a cycle of the way in which psychiatry and the mental health industry uses innovations, I think that's the question that needs to be asked. I'm all in favor of corporate responsibility, but it's not new. It's been tried for decades and decades and decades. It doesn't work to just add an ethical statement on top of.
I'm not arguing for that in any way.
I'm not speaking to you, I'm just speaking.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
I think that we need to really think very hard about the way in which science and the medicalization, science has been corrupted, and the medicalization of human suffering is part of what is continuing to dig us deeper into the hole that we're in. We need to start reconceptualizing the science and the research behind psychedelics and move away from the dominant assumptions that we've tried to address in this panel.
I'm hearing something about crisis as being a kind of profound time of opportunity, but also crisis as being a powerful governing strategy for speeding up processes of medicalization and more of the same. It's an interesting kind of double valence. Joost, how are we doing?
You're completely out of time. Final words.
Well, is that okay to go round for final words?
Well, in a minute.
Yeah, 20 seconds each. Is that possible?
58. No, wrap it up succinctly, and then I'll close the whole thing. Okay.
Well, yeah, no, thank you all. I mean, I feel like all we've done is really open a bunch of different kind of questions and issues. It would be sad for conferences going forwards when they have the kind of requisite panel on psychedelic medicalization to kind of go back to some of the more simplistic, should we medicalize, should we not? As you said at the beginning, Bennett, it's happening. But to be really kind of savvy to the complexity of what this entails. And I suppose one thing that just also come back to the beginning that I really would recommend that folks check out is we will call it Parler that was mentioned. It's a wonderful comic, online comic illustrating some of the dangers that may be in store for us. Did anyone, I want to say, does anyone want to have a final word before we give this back to Joost? We're in charge right now.
I think I think our concluding discussion on systems change is actually a great place to end. So I have nothing to add.
Grateful to be here, grateful to be part of the conversation. Everyone keep it up. We have a long road ahead of us.
I'm happy to be here. It's a tough spot to be in. I feel like I'm swimming a little bit upstream of the optimism and the gold rush that's happening. But I think that these questions are extremely important for us to be addressing because the dystopian possibilities of psychedelics we've been warned against those for a long time, and now it's actually on the table. So let's take it seriously and let's start speaking up for the kind of world that we want to live in.
Lovely. Thank you all very much. Yes.
Thank you very much for your skillful moderation of this final panel, one of the two final panels actually. Thank you very much to Bia, Daniela, to Olivia, and to David in the other panel. Participants may have come over to our side. This has been a wonderful discussion. I just wanted to add that this isn't necessarily the end of this of the discussion. You can continue the discussion in the after talks, which have been very lively. People have stayed in the after talks for hours, sometimes just continuing the discussion with the speakers. We'll give the link in the description or in the chat afterwards. And also, these are the closing words of ICPR that has finally happened after a year and a half of preparation. And at the same time, this is not really a closing. I mean, it's not like we're all going home with a few business cards and a few new contacts. Most of us were already home, right? So we're here. The conference platform will remain open until at least the end of the year. I think by now, all of the videos of all the presentations and the panels that have happened are already back online. So for those of you who still have a rest of a day ahead of you, you can watch all of those back on the Hoover platform. There's also a Discord channel that we've opened for people to continue the discussion over there. We have sent out an announcement that features the link. And then this is the moment that I go on and thank everybody, which I really need to do. First of all of the participants for their lively discussion and really for creating this vibrant and inspiring conference. You'll see my colleague Thijs. There's a window open on the top screen. We'll show you a little bit of the situation in which we found ourselves these past days. So this conference has been put together by the Open Foundation, of which I'm the executive director, in collaboration with APRA. That was the green room that Erwin moderated in just now. I'd like to thank our sponsors, MAPS and the Nakian Foundation, Dr. Bronners, Beckley, CIAS, ANT Neuro, WavePass, Riverstyx, Isomer Design, Chakroon, and Open Up, our scientific advisory board, all our musicians, all of those who provided the extracurricular activities, the indigenous practitioners, all of the researchers that I've spent countless hours with in endless consultations on really formulating the scientific discussions, the critical reflections that we've felt needed to be present in this conference. Thank you very much, everybody. That's been very enriching for me personally. I really need to thank my parents. We have two young children. My wife is actually the co-founder of Open. So Open was our first baby. We have two other kids. My parents have come to our home, have been there since Wednesday, have taken care of our kids. So this may be the same for many other people.
I'm the general manager of ICPR 2020. Mute that thing. I want to thank you all for coming here tonight, and I wanted to take a moment to do some special thanks for someone very special to us. And if you want, please follow me downstairs. Hey, you know. I wanted to take this time to thank you in person. It's been such a wild ride, and I want to say that all of you have been working super hard for this conference, but I don't think anyone is putting the hours, the energy, the positivity into this project as you. None of this could have really happened without all of your good vibes, the hard work you've put in, and for that I want to thank you on behalf of the entire ICPR team, the speakers, the attendees. Thank you guys. And I will leave it to you now. Thank you.
Okay, guys, this is not the end. This is not the end. I just wanted to acknowledge this conference has fostered so many important discussions, so much scientific research, but also all of these really important critical reflections, of which this final panel was just one beautiful example. And really what I need to end with, because Jai said this wouldn't have been possible without me, without whom it really would not have been possible, are the following people. And I'm going to name them alphabetically. Many of these people I have not seen since March in person. Many of them I have not seen in person at all. I've never met Irene. Some people are in Amsterdam right now, not with us here. Other people in our team are currently in Switzerland, in Spain, in Georgia, in Saudi Arabia, in the UK, Australia, the Philippines, Belgium, Italy, and Latvia. I'm not kidding, these people are there. They contributed to making this conference a reality. And these people are Alberto, Alexi, Alex, Alice, Anna, Andrea, Angela, Bia, Bianca, Cameron, Claire, Dan, David, Jai, Doreen, Emma, Erwin, Eva, Flores, George, Guido, Has, Irene, Jan, Jasmine, Jazz, Job, Lawrence, Lela, Lily, Malak, Maartje, Martin, Misha, Nadine, Nick, Olivier, Pavel, Philip, Peter, Raoul, Romain, Sophia, Swasti, Thijs, and Vian. And it is entirely possible that I forgot a name. There have been so many people who contributed to this over the past year and a half, because don't forget, we started putting this conference together back in March 2019 for a conference to happen in April of 2020. So to all of you, I have no words. It's been incredible. People dedicated so much time and energy to this. And I'm really grateful that we managed to make a conference that fostered so much discussion, inspiration, and connection. So I thank you with a big bow. And I'll see you on Hoeva.